A blind beggar crashed a drug lord's burial and did the impossible. He stopped them from burying the boss's son alive. The child he saved now cries for him in his sleep, and the most feared man in the city has declared this beggar untouchable. What the blind man heard that day was not a funeral dirge, but the faint, desperate sound of a heart still beating inside a sealed casket. His name was Mateo, a man who lived by sound and touch on the streets of Medellin. But to understand how he challenged a cartel's funeral, you must first see the world through his ears, a world where a gasp is a shout and a whisper can be a scream for help. This is the story of a heartbeat that defied a poison, a beggar who defied a king, and the fatal question everyone is now asking: how did the blind man know what the doctors did not? The October rain drummed a cold rhythm on the black umbrellas of the Val del Lily Cemetery in Medellin. Under a marble pavilion, 200 people stood in silence, facing a small white casket. Inside lay 9-year-old Alejandro Valdez, the only son of Don Javier Valdez, the man who controlled the city's northern cocaine routes. The boy's face, visible through the glass, was pale as wax, his dark hair neatly combed. He looked peaceful, a doll arranged by careful hands. Don Javier stood at the front, his face carved from granite. He hadn't shed a tear. Cartel bosses didn't cry, not even for their heirs. His hand, the one that had signed death warrants and built an empire on fear, rested on the casket's edge. It trembled. The priest's words blended with the rain. 6 of Javier's most trusted men, led by his lifelong lieutenant, Esteban Rojas, lifted the casket. The procession began its slow march toward the open grave waiting on the hillside. That's when a new sound cut through the solemnity. Not a sob, but a voice, raw and desperate, shouting from beyond the ring of guards. "Stop! You cannot bury him." Every head turned. Pushing past a security guard was a man, soaked to the skin, his clothes ragged. He used a long white cane to navigate the wet cobblestones, but he moved with startling purpose. His unseeing eyes were wide, fixed on a point no one else could see. Rain dripped from his matted beard. "He's not dead," the man cried out. "Please, you must listen. The boy, Alejandro, he breathes." A murmur of outrage swept through the crowd. 2 guards moved to seize him. "Get this filthy beggar out of here," a voice hissed. But Javier Valdez raised a single hand. The crowd froze. Something in the beggar's voice, not madness but a terrifying, absolute certainty, pierced through Javier's grief. He had built his power on reading lies in a man's tone. This man was not lying. "What did you say?" Javier's voice was quiet, a blade wrapped in silk. The blind man stopped struggling. He turned his head, orienting directly to the sound of Javier's voice. "Your son is alive, Don Javier. I have been listening from the wall for over an hour. I hear it, the whisper of breath, the rustle of fabric against a moving chest. Please, just check." "You're insane." The boy's mother, Isabella, clutched at her husband's arm. "Our baby is gone," the doctors said. "I was a medical student," the beggar interrupted, his voice suddenly calm, clinical. "Before the glaucoma took my sight. I know what the silence of death sounds like. And that silence is not in that box." The crowd erupted. Someone shouted for the police. The priest stepped forward, scandalized. But Javier's eyes were locked on the beggar's face. He saw the desperation, not for money, not for attention, but the sheer, visceral terror of being right. "Open it," Javier said. The gasp was collective. Esteban Rojas stepped forward, placing a cautioning hand on Javier's shoulder. "Jefe, think." 3 doctors pronounced him. "This man, he is a ghost of the streets. He hears nothing but his own delusions." "I said open it." Javier's roar silenced the rain itself. The pallbearers lowered the casket. With shaking hands, Javier himself worked the latches. The lid opened with a soft click. For a long moment, nothing. Alejandro lay perfectly still. Then, a faint, almost imperceptible mist formed on the glass panel near his lips. It came, and then it faded. A second later, it came again. A ragged breath escaped Isabella. Javier's hand flew to his son's throat. The skin was cold, but beneath his fingertips a pulse, faint and slow, like a moth beating its wings against a window pane. "Ambulance!" Javier roared, scooping the boy into his arms. "Now!" Chaos erupted. As Javier ran toward the arriving paramedics, he turned his head, his eyes finding the blind beggar standing alone in the rain. "You, what is your name?" "Mateo, sir, just Mateo." "Come with us." As they sped toward the hospital, sirens screaming, Mateo sat in the back, clutching his cane. But his heightened hearing caught a fragment, a sentence muttered into a phone by someone left behind in the chaos. A voice he recognized as Esteban's. "The plan has failed. The heartbeat, it did not stop." The hospital room was a fortress of beeping machines and sterile light. Alejandro was stabilized, placed in a medically induced coma. The diagnosis was chilling: tetrodotoxin poisoning, a rare, powerful neurotoxin that paralyzes every muscle, slows the heart and breathing to undetectable levels, mimicking death perfectly. The doctors said another hour in the casket would have meant brain death or a real, final burial. Javier stood like a statue by the window. He had sent men to verify Mateo's story. It was true. A decade ago, Mateo Fernandez was a top student at the Universidad de Antioquia's medical school. His research specialty was tropical neurotoxins. He lost his sight, his funding dried up, and he fell through the cracks of the system, becoming another invisible soul on the streets. "Why are you homeless?" Javier asked him later in a private room. "A man with your knowledge." Mateo's face was grim. "I published a paper on the misuse of tetrodotoxin by criminal groups. The wrong people read it. My advisor called it fiction. My funding vanished. Then my apartment burned." He gave a hollow laugh. "It is easier to be a blind beggar than a blind whistleblower." Javier saw no lie in him, only a weary truth. "You saved my son's life. That means you are under my protection. Anything you need." But as Mateo was given a room in the safe house, he felt the hostility, the guards' silent stares, the distrust. He had upset a delicate, deadly balance. 3 days later, Alejandro woke. The boy was weak, terrified. He would not eat, would not take his medicine from the nurses, would not sleep unless the lights were blazing. The doctors were baffled. Then Mateo entered the room. He simply sat beside the bed and began to talk, describing the sounds of the garden outside. The boy's breathing slowed. He reached out and gripped Mateo's hand. It was Mateo who could get him to sip broth. Mateo whose voice could calm his night terrors. The child, in his trauma, had latched onto the one person who had pulled him back from the dark. Isabella watched with a mixture of gratitude and heartbreaking jealousy. Javier watched with cold, calculating eyes. This blind beggar now held a piece of his son's soul. At a secret meeting with his captains, the tension boiled over. Esteban spoke carefully, but the message was clear. This beggar appears from nowhere, knows the exact poison used, and now your son is dependent on him. It is a perfect strategy for an enemy, to place a puppet inside your heart. Javier silenced them, but the seed was planted. He ordered investigations into everyone, the kitchen staff, the guards, the doctors, and into Mateo's past. That night, Alejandro spiked a fever. His new medicine, which only Esteban had fetched from the pharmacy, seemed to make him worse. Mateo, sitting vigil, heard the boy's labored breathing change, a specific wheeze he recognized from his studies. Not an infection, anticholinergic poisoning. Someone was trying again, this time more clumsily, as if desperate. He raised the alarm, saving Alejandro a second time. But the evidence pointed to a bottle only a few people had handled. The trust within Javier's inner circle was crumbling. Javier confronted his inner circle, his gaze finally landing on Esteban, his brother in arms. The man who had argued most fiercely against opening the casket. The man who had fetched the medicine. The room held its breath, the air thick with the scent of betrayal. But before Javier could speak, a guard burst in, his face ashen. "Jefe, They found something at Mateo's old spot by the cemetery wall. What? A device. A small, high-sensitive electronic stethoscope wired to a transmitter. It was not just Mateo's ears that heard that heartbeat. Someone had planted it there. Someone had wanted the blind man to hear. And that could only mean one thing. Mateo was not the savior he seemed. He was a pawn in a much darker game, and his next move would decide who lived and who would be buried for real. The device was small, sleek, and still damp from the rain. Javier Valdez turned the electronic stethoscope over in his hands. It was not some homemade contraption. It was professional, medical grade, with a wireless transmitter capable of sending audio over 300 meters. Whoever planted this, Javier said, his voice a low rumble, did not trust your ears alone, Mateo. They made sure you would hear. Mateo sat across from him in the safe house study, his face pale. He had been played. The moment of his greatest purpose, a divine calling to save a life, had been engineered. The realization was a physical blow. I heard the heartbeat. It was real. But the amplification, it was focused, directed right at the casket from the cemetery wall. Someone wanted me to be their alarm. Javier's most trusted tech specialist confirmed it. The device had been activated remotely 90 minutes before the funeral. It had been tuned to filter out ambient noise, the rain, the mourners, and amplify only the most subtle biometric sounds from inside the coffin. It was a listening gun, aimed with precision. This changes nothing about your son being alive, Mateo insisted, a desperate edge in his voice. But it changes everything about why. Javier's investigation split into two furious paths. One team dug into the device's origin. It was traced to a medical supply company in Panama, a front owned by the Cali-based Rodriguez cartel, the Valdez organization's most aggressive rival. The second team turned inward with Javier's silent order: watch everyone, especially Esteban. For Mateo, the safe house became a gilded cage. The guard's suspicion was now an open wound. Alejandro, however, remained his sole anchor. The boy's recovery was fragile, haunted by nightmares where he was trapped in the dark, unable to move or scream. Only Mateo's voice, describing the world in sound, the chirp of a cricket, the distant hum of the city, could pull him back. One afternoon, as Mateo sat with Alejandro, the boy whispered a secret that froze the blood in his veins. Tio Esteban gave me a special candy the day before I got sleepy. He said it was a secret for big boys. It tasted funny, like metal. Mateo did not react. He kept his voice gentle, weaving the confession into another story. But inside, his mind was racing. Tetrodotoxin had no taste, but some cutting agents or other paralytics used with it might. This was the first direct link. He had to tell Javier. But how? Esteban was everywhere, and Mateo knew he was being monitored. That night, using the pretext of needing air, he walked the interior courtyard. He waited until he heard the specific rhythm of Javier's footsteps, the measured, heavy tread, and moved to intersect him, speaking quickly under the cover of a fountain's noise. Alejandro remembers a candy from Esteban, the day before the poisoning. Javier did not stop walking. He did not even turn his head, but his pace slowed for a fraction of a second. That was all. The next morning, Esteban was absent from the daily security briefing. Javier announced he was sending his lieutenant to Panama to investigate the device lead personally. It was a mission of high trust, or a perfect way to remove a suspect from the board. The tension in the room was a live wire. With Esteban gone, Javier accelerated his internal purge. Bank records were pulled, phone logs decrypted. The story that emerged was one of slow, calculated betrayal. Esteban Rojas had not come to the Rodriguez cartel in a single deal. He had been bled dry by secret gambling debts for years, debts owned by a Rodriguez front company. They didn't recruit him, they owned him. The plan was elegant and brutal. Poison the air with a toxin that mimics death. Let the family bury him alive. The horror and scandal would cripple Javier, making him vulnerable. Then, Esteban, the grieving right-hand man, would help pick up the pieces, seamlessly shifting loyalty and control of the Valdez empire to the Rodriguez cartel. Alejandro's death was not the end goal. His live burial was the weapon. But they needed a miracle to stop the burial, a reason to open the casket that didn't point to them. They needed a hero no one would suspect. They found a brilliant, blind ex-medical student living in the perfect spot and gave him the ears of a god. Javier presented the evidence to his remaining captains in a silent, furious meeting. The proof was irrefutable. Wire transfers, encrypted chat logs, even surveillance photos of Esteban meeting with Rodriguez lieutenants. The betrayal was so deep it felt like a death in the family. "We bring him back," Javier declared. "We make him think he is still trusted, and then we end this." Meanwhile, Mateo, now aware of the monstrous game, felt a new kind of fear. He was not just a pawn. He was a witness who could connect the device to the crime. He was a loose end. His protection from Javier was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. He began to notice subtle changes. A new guard assigned to him, one with a raspy breath and a scent of clove cigarettes. This guard was too attentive, always within earshot. Mateo's world of sound became his radar. He heard the man's phone vibrate with a specific pattern. He heard him quietly testing the lock on Mateo's door late at night. Paranoia became strategy. Mateo started leaving tiny auditory tripwires, a cup placed precariously on the edge of a table, a floorboard he knew creaked under a certain weight. He was mapping the intentions in the dark. Then the signal came. Esteban was returning from Panama, his plane landing at midnight. Javier's plan was in motion. The house was on high alert, but the focus was on the imminent confrontation. It was the perfect time for a cleaner to tie up the loose end. Mateo was reading to Alejandro when his auditory tripwire clicked. The cup in his room had been moved. Someone was inside. He finished the sentence, his voice steady, telling Alejandro he would be right back. He stepped into the hallway, closing the bedroom door behind him. He could hear the man's breathing, smell the clove cigarettes. He was standing 10 feet away. "Don Javier wants to see you," the guard said. His voice was calm, too calm. "At this hour?" Mateo asked, taking a subtle step backward, his cane tapping. "I will come after the boy is asleep." Now the guard insisted, and Mateo heard the faint, leathery shift of a hand reaching for a weapon. In that moment, Mateo did the only thing he could. He shouted not for help but a name. Alejandro, the secret word. It was a safety word they had devised days earlier. From inside the bedroom, a shrill, piercing alarm blasted, the personal panic button Javier had given his son. The hallway erupted in light and running footsteps. The guard with the clove cigarettes melted away into the chaos. But the attempt confirmed Mateo's worst fear. The conspiracy had more players inside the house than just Esteban. The cancer was still spreading. At 2 in the morning, Esteban's car pulled into the compound. He was greeted not as a returning brother, but as a prisoner. Javier waited in the underground garage, flanked by his most loyal men. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Javier laid out the evidence. Esteban, seeing no escape, did not deny it. Instead, he smiled, a twisted, broken thing. "You think you won?" Esteban spat. "You stopped one move. The Rodriguez cartel does not play checkers, they play chess. The boy was never the only target, he was the distraction." Before Javier could demand an explanation, all the lights in the compound went out. Not just the house, the entire city block. A second later, the night erupted with the sound of shattering glass, roaring engines, and the unmistakable chatter of automatic weapons fire. The Rodriguez cartel was not waiting. They were storming the fortress. Javier's security team scrambled, shouting in the darkness. But the attackers had a map. They knew every door, every blind spot, because Esteban had not just given them a plan. He had given them the blueprints. In the pitch-black chaos, Matteo grabbed Alejandro from his bed. He could hear the gunfire moving closer, floor by floor. There was only one place he knew the attackers might not have on their map: the old, disused laundry chute that led to a basement service tunnel, a secret Alejandro had told him about during a story. He felt his way along the wall, the boy clinging to him, too terrified to make a sound. Behind them, the door to the bedroom splintered open. As Matteo pushed Alejandro into the narrow, concrete chute, a spray of gunfire tore into the wall where his head had been just a second before. He tumbled in after the boy, falling into the darkness, with the sounds of a full-scale war raging above. The concrete chute was a vertical tomb, swallowing them in darkness and the smell of old dust. Matteo wrapped himself around Alejandro, taking the brunt of the fall as they slammed into a pile of discarded linens at the bottom. For a moment, there was only the boy's whimper and the distant, muffled thunder of battle above. "We have to move," Matteo whispered, his hands frantically mapping their prison. It was a small concrete room with one rusted metal door. His fingers found the latch. It was bolted from the outside. Above, the gunfire was growing more sporadic. Then, a new sound, the methodical thump of explosive charges. They were breaching the safe room doors, one by one. The Rodriguez assault team was methodical, professional. They weren't just attacking, they were cleaning house. "Papa," Alejandro cried, his voice a tiny fracture in the dark. "He's fighting," Matteo said, forcing certainty into his tone. "But we must be quiet now, like the mice in the story." He pressed his ear to the door. He could hear two things: the drip of water in a pipe, and beyond that the faint echo of footsteps in a larger space. They were in a basement, but not alone. He ran his hands over the walls, his trained fingers reading the texture like braille. In one corner, the concrete was newer, a patch job. He dug at the edges with his fingernails. A piece crumbled away. Behind it was not more concrete, but rotten wood. Using his shoulder, he pushed. The wood gave way with a splintering crack, revealing a narrow crawl space, an old utility run for plumbing. It was a way out or a deeper trap. Upstairs, Javier Valdez was a storm of violence. With the power out, the fight had devolved into a close-quarter nightmare of flashlights and muzzle flashes. He had lost 5 men, but they had taken twice that number of attackers. He fought his way toward the master bedroom, where Isabella was barricaded. But when he kicked in the door, he found not his wife, but a note taped to her vanity mirror. "You saved the boy. A noble instinct. We have the mother. The price for her is your network, your roots, and your surrender by dawn. Or we send her back to you in pieces, starting with the fingers that held your son." The note was signed with a single, stylized R, the mark of Raul Rodriguez. Javier's roar of fury echoed through the shot-up hallway. Esteban had been a tool. The poisoning, the attack, all of it was theater to pull Javier's forces to the compound, to leave his wife vulnerable at a separate safe house she had fled to earlier that day. They had played him perfectly. In the tunnel, Matteo and Alejandro crawled through damp, cramped darkness. The boy was trembling uncontrollably. Matteo talked constantly, a stream of low, reassuring nonsense mapping their progress by sound. The drip of water grew louder. The air grew colder. Then his hand brushed against something metal and cylindrical, a pipe, and clamped to it a small, boxy device with a faint, regular tick. He froze. His mind flashed back to his military service training decades ago. The sound, the form, it was a motion-triggered demolition charge, a failsafe. The entire tunnel system was rigged to collapse. "Don't move," he breathed to Alejandro. "Not an inch." He had no tools, no sight, but he had the memory of a schematic from his student days, interning at the city's public works department. This was part of an old flood control system. The charge would be on a timer, triggered by the breach of a laser or pressure plate. He had already moved, so why hadn't it blown? Because it wasn't armed yet, he realized. It was waiting for a remote signal, the final cleanup. He had to find the receiver. He followed the wires from the charge with his fingertips, crawling slowly, Alejandro clutching the back of his shirt. The wires led to a junction box bolted to the wall. Inside, a small green light glowed, active. At that moment from above, through a grate, he heard two voices. They were speaking in low, hurried Spanish. Confirm the secondary target is acquired. The mother is secure. Primary target, the boy, is still missing in the compound. The other voice answered. Then burn it all, trigger the charges in the tunnels, collapse the substructure, bury any evidence and anyone left inside. The green light on the junction box began to flash. Mateo's hands flew over the box. He couldn't see the mechanism, but he could feel it. There was a main cable and a backup battery. He ripped at the wires, his fingers bleeding on the sharp edges. He pulled the primary cable loose. The green light stayed on, now powered by the battery. He found the backup leads and yanked. The light went dark. But the ticking from the charge on the pipe continued. It had its own independent power. They had seconds. There's a valve, Alejandro whispered, his voice shaky. A big red wheel on the pipe. I see it in the light from the box. What light? Mateo asked, confused. From the little green light. It's off now, but there's a glow stick taped next to it. A chemical light stick, a marker. Mateo felt a surge of hope. Where's the wheel, mi vida? Guide me. To the left, up a little more. Mateo's hand found the large, spoked valve wheel. He heaved with all his strength. It didn't budge. The ticking seemed to grow louder. Help me, Alejandro, both hands. The small hands covered his own, and together they strained. With a shriek of rust, the wheel turned a quarter inch, then a half. A torrent of stagnant, icy water erupted from the pipe, soaking them, but the ticking from the charge sputtered and died. The water had shorted it out. They collapsed, gasping, but the voices above had heard the gush of water. A flashlight beam stabbed down through the grate. Down here, one shouted. Mateo grabbed Alejandro and they ran, stumbling through the ankle-deep water, no longer caring about stealth. The tunnel opened into a larger drainage culvert that led out to the street. They could see the night sky, the flashing blue and red of distant police lights. But blocking the culvert's mouth were two silhouettes, backlit by the city glow. They were holding submachine guns. Mateo pushed Alejandro behind him, his mind racing. He had one weapon, truth. He knows, Mateo shouted, his voice echoing in the pipe. The boy knows about the bank in Panama. He heard Esteban talking about it. It was a desperate, wild guess, based on the earlier mention of Panama and the financial roots of the betrayal. But it struck a nerve. The two men hesitated, exchanging a glance. The boy was a witness to more than they thought. In that split second of hesitation, a new voice barked from the street behind the two gunmen. Federal police, drop your weapons. A flood of bright light filled the culvert. Shots rang out. The two gunmen fell. Standing in the light was not a police commander, but a grim-faced Javier Valdez, surrounded by his three most hardened survivors. He had used the police scanner code as a distraction. Javier rushed forward, sweeping Alejandro into his arms. His eyes met Mateo's, and for the first time, Mateo saw something beyond calculation or rage. He saw raw, unshielded fear. They have Isabella. They want everything for her. Then Javier's look hardened into resolve. He looked at the two dead Rodriguez gunmen, then at Mateo. You heard them. What bank in Panama? It was a bluff. I don't know. Javier's phone buzzed. He looked at it and his face went gray. He showed the screen to Mateo. It was a live feed. Isabella, blindfolded, sitting in a concrete room. A masked man held a knife to her throat. A message scrolled below, the clock is ticking. The boy and the blind man come to us or she dies slowly. It was a trap within a trap. They didn't just want Javier's empire. They wanted to exterminate his bloodline and the inconvenient witness, all in one move. And they were using his wife as the bait. Javier made the call. To his remaining captains, to his allies in the city's underworld, to every debt owed to him. He was calling in every marker, arming every soldier. This was no longer a covert war. This was a declaration of total war on the Rodriguez cartel to be fought in the streets before dawn. But as his men mobilized, a deeper, more chilling report came in. The Rodriguez cartel had not just taken Isabella. They had, in the chaos, also seized control of Javier's primary shipping warehouse at the port. Inside was not just cocaine, but his entire digital ledger, a blockchain-encrypted record of every transaction, every corrupt official, every connection across continents. It was the keys to the kingdom. Esteban's betrayal had given them the location, but the assault on the compound had been the diversion to seize it. The boy had been the initial distraction. The mother was the emotional lever, but the ledger was the real prize. With it, the Rodriguez cartel could dismantle Javier's network from within, turning his own allies against him with proof of their dealings. Javier stood amidst the ruins of his home, the scale of his defeat settling over him. He had saved his son, only to lose his wife and his empire in the same night. He looked at Mateo, who stood shivering in the tunnel mouth, a blind man who had seen too much. "You have a choice," Javier said, his voice hollow. "Take Alejandro, I have a car. It can get you to the border to safety. You owe us nothing." Mateo listened to the sounds of the wounded, the distant sirens, the panicked whispers of Javier's men. He thought of the candy, the electronic stethoscope, the charge in the tunnel. He thought of the boy clinging to his leg. He had spent years in the dark, believing he had no purpose, no agency. This was not a choice. It was a diagnosis. "I can't run," Mateo said, "and you can't fight them head-on. They're waiting for that. You have to do what they never expect." "What?" "You have to give them exactly what they want. You have to surrender." Javier's men stirred, angry murmurs rising. But Javier held up a hand, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." "They think they have all the leverage. Your wife, your ledger, your predictable rage. They expect a bloody assault on their stronghold. So don't give it to them. Walk in alone. Give them the one thing their ledger, their guns, their poison can't account for." "What's that?" "A man who has already lost everything," Mateo said softly. "A blind beggar they think is a pawn. Walk in with me. Let me be your eyes. And when they are busy laughing at the two broken men in front of them, we take it all back." It was a suicide mission, a fool's gamble. But as the first hint of dawn tinged the sky with blood-orange light, Javier Valdez, the king of the city, nodded. He handed his favorite pistol to his most loyal captain. He kept only a small blade strapped to his ankle. Then he turned to Mateo. "How do we start?" Mateo's face was a mask of focused calm. "We start by calling them. We tell them we're coming, and we make sure they believe they've already won." He picked up Javier's phone, his fingers hovering over the keys. The final, desperate play was about to begin, and the entire city would hold its breath to see who would be left standing when the sun rose. The call was made on an open line, knowing the Rodriguez cartel would be listening. Javier's voice, stripped of its usual command, was a masterpiece of defeated rage. He agreed to their terms. He would come alone to the old textile factory on the river, the Rodriguez stronghold. He would bring the boy and the blind man. He would sign over his assets, all for Isabella's life. It was a performance, and Mateo was his director. Every stumble in Javier's speech, every crack of despair, was carefully placed. They wanted the cartel to feel the thrill of total victory, to get sloppy. The factory at dawn was a monument to decay. Javier drove, with Mateo in the passenger seat and Alejandro curled fearfully in the back. They were scanned, patted down, and led inside at gunpoint. The main floor was a vast, empty space. Raul Rodriguez stood on a metal walkway above, flanked by a dozen men. Below, in a chair at the center of the concrete floor, sat Isabella, bruised but defiant. "Well, Javier," Raul called down, his voice echoing, "you look diminished. Where is your army?" Javier kept his head down. "Where is your word? Let my wife go. First the boy, and the blind dog who caused all this trouble. Bring them forward. Guards shoved Matteo and Alejandro toward the center. Matteo's cane tapped nervously. He was listening, mapping the room. The echo told him its size. The hum of electronics came from the walkway computers, likely containing the stolen ledger. The rasp of breath from 6 men on the ground floor, 4 more on the walkway. And the faint, rhythmic beep of a cell phone on vibrate coming from the guard closest to Isabella. Raul descended the stairs, a sleek pistol in his hand. He walked a slow circle around Matteo. The famous ears. Tell me, Beggar, what do you hear now? I hear a man who is afraid, Matteo said quietly. Raul laughed. Of what? Of the silence that comes after the gunshot. You have everything. The ledger, the territory, your rival on his knees, but you're still here, talking. Because once you pull that trigger, the story is over. And you're just another killer in a dirty factory. You want the legend more than the win. Raul's smile vanished. He raised the pistol, pressing it to Matteo's forehead. You think you're clever. Matteo didn't flinch. His hand tightened on his cane. Check the ledger. Transaction 742. The payment from your Panamanian bank to Esteban Rojas. You'll find a digital fingerprint, a tracking algorithm I embedded in the document when I analyzed the toxin data years ago. The moment you opened that file, it started broadcasting its location to every federal agency with a cyber warrant for your name. It was a bluff of monumental proportions. Matteo had no such program, but he knew Raul's type, paranoid, tech-savvy. The seed of doubt was all he needed. Raul hesitated, his eyes flicking toward his tech lieutenant on the walkway. A second of uncertainty. That was the signal. Javier dropped his submissive posture. His hand shot to his ankle, drawing the hidden blade. He didn't throw it at Raul. He threw it at the fluorescent light fixture directly above Isabella's chair. The tube shattered, plunging that corner of the factory into deeper shadow. At the same moment, Matteo moved. He didn't attack Raul. He swung his white cane not at a person but at the guard standing near Isabella, the one with the buzzing phone. The hard tip of the cane connected with the man's wrist. The phone clattered to the ground. It wasn't a phone. It was the remote detonator for the explosives rigged under the factory floor, a final cleanup Raul had planned. Chaos erupted. Gunfire broke out, but not from Raul's men. Javier's remaining loyalists, who had infiltrated the riverfront sewers hours earlier on Matteo's auditory instructions, blew the factory's side doors. The assault was precise, brutal, and focused on the walkway. In the confusion, Matteo followed the sound of Isabella's breathing. He found her, cut her bonds with a shard of the broken light tube, and shoved her toward Alejandro. Get to the wall. Left 30 paces. Javier was a force of nature, disarming a guard and using his own weapon to clear a path. But Raul Rodriguez, realizing the trap, made his move. He grabbed Alejandro, who had been trying to reach his mother, and held a knife to the boy's throat, backing toward a side exit. Let him go, Javier roared, all his plans unraveling. Or what, you'll kill me? Then the boy dies too, Raul sneered. Matteo stood still, his head cocked. He heard something beneath the gunfire and shouts. A new sound, a low, rising wail, police sirens, not just any, the distinctive triple tone of the National Police's tactical unit. Matteo's bluff about the tracker had been a lie, but Javier's call to a certain corrupt police commander, promising the entire Rodriguez cartel on a silver platter, had been very real. The authorities were here, and they were not on Raul's payroll. The sirens spooked Raul's men. Their disciplined formation broke. In that instant of distraction, Javier moved. He didn't shoot. He threw his empty pistol at Raul's head. As Raul flinched, Alejandro bit down hard on the arm holding him. Raul screamed, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. Matteo, who had been tracking Raul's position by his voice and footsteps, lunged. He didn't tackle the cartel boss. He barreled into Alejandro, knocking the boy out of Raul's grasp and into a stack of empty pallets. The knife meant for Alejandro's throat slashed across Mateo's shoulder instead, a searing line of fire. Javier was on Raul then. The fight was short and vicious. When it was over, Raul Rodriguez lay unmoving on the concrete. The police stormed the factory, rounding up the remaining cartel members. Javier, covered in blood, both his and his enemy, stumbled to his family, gathering Isabella and Alejandro into his arms. He looked over at Mateo, who was being helped by a medic, a bandage pressed to his shoulder. Their eyes met. The debt was paid in full. The aftermath was a whirlwind. With Raul dead and his top lieutenants captured, the Rodriguez cartel fragmented. Javier Valdez, leveraging his cooperation and the recovered digital ledger, negotiated a fragile peace with the authorities. He ceded control of several key trafficking routes, effectively downsizing his empire, but in return, he received something priceless: legitimacy for his legitimate businesses and a clean slate for his family. A month later, the Valdez family stood on the tarmac of a private airfield. Alejandro, his health finally restored, clung to Mateo's hand. Isabella embraced the blind man warmly. "The papers are filed," Javier said, his voice different now, quieter. "The foundation in your name. The Mateo Fernandez Institute for Neurotoxin Research and Medical Ethics, fully funded. Your old university has already agreed to partner. You'll have labs, a staff, a home." Mateo was silent, overwhelmed. The world he had been exiled from was not just opening its doors, it was handing him the keys. And Javier hesitated, an uncharacteristic awkwardness in his tone. "There is a house on the Institute's grounds, for the director, and for his family should he ever wish to reconcile." He placed a sealed letter in Mateo's hand. It was from Mateo's daughter in Spain, a reply to a letter Javier had helped send. The first contact in 8 years. Mateo couldn't speak, he simply nodded. As the family boarded their plane to a new, quieter life abroad, Alejandro broke away and ran back, throwing his arms around Mateo. "You'll visit every summer." "Every summer," Mateo promised, his voice thick. He stood on the tarmac, listening until the sound of the jet faded into the hum of the city. He was no longer a beggar by the cemetery wall. He was a man with a future, a man who had used the very thing that broke him, his sensitivity to sound, his knowledge of poisons, to save a life and break a cycle of violence. But as his driver took him toward the city, Mateo replayed the events in his mind. There was one detail that didn't fit: a ghost in the machine. The electronic stethoscope planted at the cemetery. The Rodriguez cartel had the means, but Esteban, in his final confession, had seemed genuinely surprised by its sophistication. And the guard with the clove cigarettes who tried to kill Mateo in the hallway, he was never identified among the captured Rodriguez gunmen. Mateo leaned forward to the driver, one of Javier's nariformed men. The guard with the cough, the one who smelled of cloves. "Did anyone ever find out who he was?" The driver shifted uncomfortably. "That was never resolved, senor. Some thought he might have been police. Not ours, federal. There were rumors that certain powerful people were watching, making sure the confrontation between Javier and Raul happened, to clear the field." Mateo sat back, a chill settling over him. He had believed the story was over, a tidy end. But he now wondered if he and Javier had merely been pieces in a much larger, quieter game. The thought stayed with him, a faint, discordant note in his newfound peace, a reminder that some truths, like some heartbeats, are felt only by those who know how to listen in the silence. And so, the story of the blind beggar and the drug lord's son becomes a legend in Medellin, a parable told in whispers. But the true weight of this story isn't in the bullets or the betrayals. It's in the quiet, almost impossible truth at its core, that in a world ruled by the power to make people disappear, the most subversive act was the refusal to let someone be unseen. Mateo Fernandez, the man who was once a ghost, now runs a world-class research institute. His work focuses on countering biotoxins used in criminal acts and improving diagnostic tools for comatose patients. He has reconciled with his daughter. He is, by any measure, a man who reclaimed his life. Javier Valdez retired from the narcotics trade. The businesses he still owns are legitimate, if shadowed by their past. His family lives quietly, far from Colombia. Alejandro is a healthy teenager, and he does, in fact, visit Mateo every summer. But the question that began this story remains, echoing in the spaces between the facts. How did a blind man see what an entire city missed? The answer is both simpler and more profound than any paradox. He didn't see, he listened. In a cemetery full of people consumed by grief, ritual, and power plays, Mateo was the only one paying attention to the one thing that mattered, the fragile signal of life itself. His blindness wasn't a supernatural gift. It was a focusing lens, stripping away the visual noise that distracts us from the essential truths happening just beneath the surface. The lingering chill, the ghost in the machine of this story, is the hint that Mateo's listening may have uncovered an even deeper truth, that the war between two cartels was merely the surface conflict, and that other, colder actors in suits and government offices may have been pulling strings, happy to let the violent men destroy each other. It's a reminder that the most dangerous forces are often the ones that make no sound at all. This tale challenges a fundamental assumption, that power belongs only to those who can impose their will. But here, power was ultimately wielded by the man with nothing, who offered only his attention and his courage. He didn't have a weapon, he had a responsibility, and in the end, that proved to be the most disruptive force of all. It leaves us with a question to carry into our own lives, in a world saturated with distraction. What are we failing to hear because we are too busy looking? What vital heartbeats are we missing in the noise? If you found yourself pulled into this story of how a single act of attention changed everything, then you understand the power of listening. For more deep dives into the unseen forces that shape our world, into the stories that happen just beyond the glare of the spotlight, make sure to subscribe. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it whispers. It's up to us to lean in and hear it.